There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around with them, assembled from films and textbooks and half-remembered news footage, and that version is not exactly wrong, but it is not honest either. It was never designed to be honest. It was designed to be manageable, to fit into categories that already existed, to confirm what people already believed about American power and American purpose and the way wars begin and end. The problem with the Vietnam War is not that it was misunderstood. The problem is that it was misrepresented systematically, deliberately, and at every level of the chain of command, from the soldiers filling out after-action reports in the field to the generals briefing the Secretary of Defense in air-conditioned rooms in Saigon, to the officials standing at podiums in Washington, telling the American public that progress was being made. Progress was always being made. That was the first thing you learned if you paid attention. No matter what happened on the ground, no matter how many men were lost or how many villages were destroyed or how many operations ended in confusion and retreat, the official narrative was always oriented toward progress, toward light at the end of the tunnel. The tunnel itself kept getting longer, but the light was always there, just ahead, just beyond the next operation, the next escalation, the next set of numbers. The numbers are where this story really begins, because the Vietnam War was, in a way that no previous American conflict had been, a war managed by statistics. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, and then Johnson, came to the Pentagon from Ford Motor Company, where he had been one of the original whiz kids, men who believed that data could solve any problem if you gathered enough of it and analyzed it correctly. He brought that belief to the prosecution of a counterinsurgency war in Southeast Asia, and what followed was one of the most sustained and consequential acts of institutional self-deception in American military history. The military had always kept records, but what McNamara and his analysts demanded was something different. They wanted quantifiable progress. They wanted metrics that could be tracked over time, graphed, compared, presented to the president as evidence that the war was being won. And so the military produced those metrics. Whether or not they reflected reality was a secondary concern, and in many cases, no concern at all. The body count became the primary measure of success, not territory held, because the war was not really about territory in any traditional sense. Not political stability, because the South Vietnamese government was too fractured and corrupt to serve as a reliable benchmark. Not popular support, because nobody had a reliable way to measure what the Vietnamese peasants actually believed or wanted. Bodies, though, could be counted, or at least something could be counted and called a body count, and that number could be reported up the chain of command, and it would be received as evidence of progress, and careers would be built on it, and strategies would be adjusted based on it, and the war would continue to be prosecuted in its name. The body count as an official metric created an immediate and obvious incentive structure that almost nobody in the military talked about publicly, and almost everybody in the military understood privately. The incentive was to produce high numbers. The pressure came from above, consistently and relentlessly. Commanders were evaluated based on their kill ratios. Units were compared against each other based on their reported enemy casualties. Officers who produced impressive body counts were promoted. Officers who produced modest body counts were questioned, reviewed, sometimes reassigned. What this meant in practice, in the villages and rice paddies and jungle clearings where the actual fighting happened, was that the definition of enemy became elastic. It expanded to meet the demand. Under the rules of engagement as they were formally written, the enemy was defined as armed combatants engaged in hostile action against American or South Vietnamese forces. Under the rules of engagement as they were practically applied in many units and in many situations, the enemy was defined as any Vietnamese male of military age found in a free-fire zone, or any Vietnamese person, male or female, adult or child, found dead after an engagement. The phrase that became shorthand for this reality was, if it's dead and it's Vietnamese, it's VC. That phrase was not invented after the war by critics trying to make a point. It was used during the war in the field by soldiers, as a description of how the reporting system actually functioned. Bodies were counted and classified as enemy combatants, regardless of whether those people had been armed, regardless of whether they had been engaged in hostile activity, regardless in some cases of whether they had been killed by American fire at all. Vietnamese civilians who died in artillery strikes or airstrikes or as a result of combat operations in their vicinity were entered into the body count as enemy killed in action. This was not a rogue practice confined to a few reckless units. It was widespread, documented by journalists who were paying attention, understood by officers at multiple levels of command, and tolerated because the alternative was to report numbers that did not demonstrate progress. The inflation was not uniform. Some units maintained stricter standards. Some commanders genuinely tried to record only confirmed enemy combatants. But the system as a whole was corrupted by its own incentive structure, and that corruption flowed upward through every level of reporting. When a brigade commander submitted his after-action reports to the division, the numbers had already been shaped by the pressure from above. When the division submitted to MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam in Saigon, the numbers had been shaped again. When MACV assembled the weekly and monthly figures that were presented to Washington, the accumulated distortion of thousands of individual reports was packaged into a coherent narrative of progress. The officials in Washington who received those figures and used them to brief the President and brief Congress and brief the press were not, for the most part, lying in the sense of knowing the truth and deliberately saying something different. Many of them believed the numbers or believed enough of the numbers to continue the policy because the alternative was to admit that the entire framework for measuring success was fraudulent and that admission was not available to them psychologically or politically. There were people who knew. There were analysts within the CIA and within the Defense Intelligence Agency who produced assessments that directly contradicted the optimistic picture being painted by MACV. In 1967, a major internal battle was fought within the American intelligence community over a fundamental question: how many enemy combatants were there? MACV, under General Westmoreland, had been reporting enemy strength figures in the range of 200,000 to 300,000. CIA analysts, led by Sam Adams, had conducted their own analysis and concluded that the actual number was closer to 600,000 and possibly higher once you included the various categories of irregular fighters and support personnel that MACV had chosen not to count. The difference was not trivial. If the enemy force was twice as large as MACV was reporting, then the kill ratios and attrition figures that were being used to demonstrate progress were not demonstrating anything of the kind. If you were killing 20,000 enemy soldiers a month, but the enemy could replace them and expand at the same time, then the war of attrition was not working. MACV fought to suppress the higher estimate. Westmoreland's command argued that the CIA figures were inflated, that the irregular forces the analysts wanted to include were not really military threats in the relevant sense. The argument was partly substantive and partly bureaucratic and partly political, and in the end, a compromise figure was produced that satisfied nobody and resolved nothing, and the official estimates continued to be reported in ways that sustained the narrative of progress. Sam Adams spent years after the war trying to bring this story to public attention. He testified before the Church Committee. He cooperated with a CBS documentary in 1982 that accused Westmoreland and his command of deliberately suppressing intelligence about enemy strength. Westmoreland sued CBS for defamation. The lawsuit dragged on for years and ended in a settlement that satisfied neither side and clarified nothing for the public. Adams died in 1988, still trying to document what he had witnessed. The documentary record he helped assemble has been analyzed by historians for decades, and the consensus that has emerged is that the distortion of enemy strength estimates was real, was significant, and was a direct consequence of the institutional pressure to demonstrate progress in a war where progress could not be demonstrated honestly. The pressure on intelligence was not limited to order of battle estimates. It extended to assessments of the pacification program, the effort to win the loyalty of the rural Vietnamese population by providing security, economic development, and political stability. The pacification program went through multiple iterations and multiple names over the course of the war, and at various points it was managed by the CIA, by the military, by civilian agencies, and by a hybrid organization called CORDS, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, which was created in 1967 under Robert Comer, a CIA veteran who became known as Blowtorch Bob for his aggressive management style. CORDS developed a measurement system called the Hamlet Evaluation System, which assigned each of South Vietnam's roughly 12,000 hamlets a rating from A to E based on their level of security and loyalty to the Saigon government. The ratings were compiled monthly and aggregated into province-level and national-level assessments that were supposed to give Washington an accurate picture of how the pacification effort was proceeding. The Hamlet Evaluation System was, in its conception, a reasonable attempt to bring some rigor to a genuinely difficult measurement problem. In its execution, it was another engine of distortion. The evaluators who rated the hamlets were American military advisors and civilian officials who were embedded in South Vietnamese provinces and districts, and they were subject to the same pressures as everyone else in the system. Their superiors wanted to see progress. The officials in Saigon wanted to report progress to Washington. The officials in Washington wanted to report progress to Congress and the President, and so the evaluators produced ratings that reflected those desires more than they reflected conditions on the ground. Hamlets that were insecure, that were contested by the Viet Cong, that were populated by people who had no particular loyalty to the Saigon government, were rated as relatively secure and relatively loyal, because the alternative was to produce an assessment that contradicted the official story. Some evaluators tried to be honest and found their assessments overridden or ignored. Others adapted to the system and produced the numbers that were expected. The Tet Offensive in January and February of 1968 was, among other things, a brutal empirical test of the Hamlet Evaluation System and the pacification assessments more generally. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including the imperial capital of Hue and the American embassy compound in Saigon. The offensive demonstrated, unmistakably and publicly, that the security the pacification program claimed to have established was largely illusory. Hamlets that had been rated as secure were found to contain Viet Cong infrastructure that had been operating undetected, or at least unreported, for years. The urban populations that were supposed to have been won over to the South Vietnamese government's side did not rise up in support of the attackers, as the communists had hoped, but they also did not demonstrate the kind of loyalty and resistance that the pacification assessments had implied. The Tet Offensive was a military failure for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in the sense that their attacks were ultimately repulsed with heavy casualties. It was a political catastrophe for the American government because it exposed the gap between what officials had been saying and what was actually true. Walter Cronkite flew to Vietnam and came back and told the American public that the war appeared to be a stalemate, and Lyndon Johnson reportedly said that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America, and within weeks Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election. But none of this stopped the war. The war continued for 7 more years after Tet. 7 years during which the United States gradually withdrew its ground forces under the policy Nixon called Vietnamization, while continuing to bomb North Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos on a scale that was, in some periods, larger than the bombing that had been conducted before Tet. The war did not end because the American government concluded it could not be won. The war ended when it became politically and financially impossible to continue it. And even then it did not end cleanly or honestly. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were presented to the American public as peace with honor, a phrase Nixon and Kissinger used repeatedly, and that phrase was a lie in the specific technical sense that the people who used it knew it was false. The Accords left North Vietnamese forces in place in the south. They did not require the withdrawal of those forces as a condition of the agreement. American military advisors were removed, and American prisoners of war were returned. But the fundamental military situation on the ground in South Vietnam was not resolved. The accords bought time, roughly 2 years, before North Vietnam launched the final offensive that completed its conquest of the South in April 1975. The soldiers who were in Vietnam during the years between Tet and the withdrawal understood the war differently from the soldiers who had arrived earlier, in the period of relative optimism and institutional confidence. By 1969 and 1970, the change in the character of the American military effort in Vietnam was visible to anyone who was paying attention, which most of the soldiers in the field certainly were. The withdrawal had begun. Units were being rotated home. The men who remained knew that the United States was leaving, that the question was not whether, but when, and that the answer to the question of what they were fighting for had become genuinely unclear. In the early years of the war, when casualties were high and the military still believed in the effectiveness of search and destroy operations, there had at least been a comprehensible strategic logic, however flawed. Find the enemy, fix the enemy, destroy the enemy. Attrit the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces faster than they could be replaced, and eventually they would lose the will or the capacity to fight. That logic had failed, but it had at least been a logic. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, that logic had been abandoned without being replaced by anything coherent. American soldiers were still dying. American operations were still being conducted. But nobody could explain with any clarity what those operations were supposed to accomplish in the context of a war that everyone knew was winding down toward an exit. The phenomenon that military historians have documented most carefully from this period is what was called combat refusal, or in some cases fragging. And both of these phenomena reflected the breakdown of institutional authority and individual motivation that characterized the last years of American involvement. Combat refusal, in which soldiers declined to follow orders to conduct operations they regarded as pointless or suicidal, occurred with increasing frequency after 1969. The military's own records documented hundreds of incidents, and the actual number was certainly higher because many incidents were handled informally, at the unit level, without formal documentation. Fragging, the killing or wounding of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own troops, typically using fragmentation grenades, was documented in a substantial number of cases and suspected in many more. The military tracked fragging incidents as a separate category of reportable offense, which itself indicates the scale of the problem. The estimates of the total number of fragging incidents during the Vietnam War range from several hundred confirmed cases to over 1,000 suspected cases, representing a level of internal violence that had no real precedent in American military history. The drug situation during the same period was severe in ways that were known to military commanders and largely suppressed in official communications. By the early 1970s, a significant proportion of American soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin, which was available cheaply and in high purity throughout South Vietnam, often sold in the streets outside American bases, sometimes sold by vendors operating in the vicinity of those bases with a regularity that implied some degree of local tolerance or corruption. The military's own surveys, conducted between 1970 and 1972, found rates of heroin use among combat soldiers that ranged from 10 to 20% in some units to considerably higher in others. A 1971 congressional report, drawing on military data, found that approximately 35,000 soldiers were addicted to heroin. These figures represented not just a public health problem, but a military readiness problem of a serious nature. And the military's response to it was complicated by the fact that the drug problem was itself a symptom of the broader morale collapse, which was itself a symptom of the strategic incoherence, which was itself something that could not be officially acknowledged without undermining the political rationale for continuing the war. The military did eventually implement drug testing and amnesty programs, but these programs were implemented in the context of a withdrawal that was already underway, and they were as much about managing the optics of the drug problem for domestic consumption as they were about actually addressing addiction among soldiers. Men who tested positive for heroin could enter treatment programs, and some did, and some were helped by those programs. But the structural conditions that had produced the drug epidemic, the purposelessness, the boredom, the fear, the moral confusion, the sense of being expendable in a war that nobody believed in anymore, those conditions could not be treated by a detoxification program. The moral confusion that developed among American soldiers during the Vietnam War had specific and documentable roots that went beyond the general demoralization of a losing effort. It was grounded in the specific nature of the conflict itself, in the impossibility of distinguishing combatants from civilians, in the tactics that were employed, in the things that soldiers were asked to do and witnessed being done, and in the institutional pressure to report those things in ways that did not match what had actually happened. The difficulty of distinguishing between the Viet Cong and the civilian population was not an accident of geography or Vietnamese culture. It was a fundamental feature of the insurgency as a political and military strategy. The Viet Cong operated among the civilian population deliberately and systematically. They recruited from villages, taxed villages, stored supplies in villages, and used the physical cover of civilian settlements as protection against American firepower. This was not a mystery to American military planners. It was understood from the earliest years of the conflict. The strategic response to it, however, was applied in ways that created the conditions for systematic violence against the civilian population. The Free Fire Zone, or Specified Strike Zone, as it was officially called for a period, because the phrase Free Fire Zone was creating negative press coverage, was a geographic area designated by military and political authorities as containing no friendly civilians. Within a free fire zone, any living person or structure could be treated as an enemy target. The logic was that civilians in those areas had been warned to leave, that evacuation programs had offered them the opportunity to relocate to secure areas, and that anyone who remained had either chosen to support the enemy or had been compelled to remain by the enemy, and was therefore either a legitimate target or an acceptable casualty. The practical application of this logic across millions of acres of Vietnamese territory that were designated as free fire zones at various points in the war produced a level of civilian suffering that was documented in real time by journalists and military investigators, and that was consistently minimized or denied in official communications. The air war, which operated in accordance with free fire zone designations and with a bombing campaign of unprecedented scale, killed Vietnamese civilians in numbers that remain disputed, but were certainly in the hundreds of thousands. The United States dropped more ordnance on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos combined than was dropped by all sides during the entire Second World War. That fact is recorded and verifiable. The effects of that bombing on the civilian population, on the agricultural economy, on the physical landscape, on the long-term habitability of large portions of the country, were documented in military assessments that circulated within the government and that were not made available to the American public in any coherent form during the war. The bombing of Cambodia, which began in March 1969 under Nixon, was conducted in secret. The official flight records were falsified. Actual targets in Cambodia were recorded as targets in South Vietnam in the official documentation so that the bombing campaign could be concealed from Congress and from the public. The falsification of records was systematic and was ordered from the highest levels of the chain of command. When the secret bombing of Cambodia became public knowledge in 1969, through a leak to the New York Times, and then more broadly as the war expanded into Cambodia in 1970, the Nixon administration's response was to launch wiretapping programs against journalists and government officials suspected of being the sources of leaks. The internal surveillance apparatus that began as a response to leaks about Cambodia eventually contributed to the Watergate scandal, but that connection was rarely made explicit in the public discussion of either the war or the constitutional crisis that followed it. The specific experience of the soldiers who conducted ground operations in Vietnam during the years of heaviest American involvement, roughly 1965 through 1971, has been documented in thousands of oral histories, memoirs, congressional testimonies, and journalistic accounts, and what emerges from that documentation is a picture that is consistently more disturbing and more complicated than the official record acknowledged. The operational reality of search and destroy missions was that they rarely achieved their stated objectives. The enemy, by design, avoided set-piece engagements where American firepower would be decisive. They chose when and where to engage, struck when conditions favored them, and dispersed into the civilian population or into jungle terrain where pursuit was difficult or impossible. American units would move through an area, sustain casualties from ambushes and booby traps, find few or no enemy combatants to engage, and then call in artillery or airstrikes on villages or tree lines that might or might not contain enemy forces, and then report the operation as a success based on body count figures that might or might not reflect actual enemy casualties. The booby trap problem was particularly corrosive to morale and to the psychological coherence of the soldiers who endured it. A substantial proportion of American casualties in Vietnam, estimates range from 20 to 30% of combat deaths in some periods, were caused not by direct engagement with enemy forces, but by mines, punjai stakes, and improvised explosive devices. The effect of this on unit psychology was to create a constant low-level dread that attached itself to the landscape itself. Every step on an unfamiliar path, every rice paddy dike, every doorway and water buffalo trail and cluster of bamboo could be lethal. The enemy who planted the mines and set the traps was invisible, indistinguishable from the surrounding population, possibly the same farmers and women and children that American forces were theoretically there to protect. The psychological pressure this created pushed soldiers toward a generalized hostility toward the civilian environment that was entirely understandable as a psychological response and entirely catastrophic in its moral and practical implications. The village of My Lai has become the most famous instance of what that hostility could produce under specific conditions, and it has also, in becoming famous, been used in a way that is historically misleading. My Lai was presented in official and popular discourse as an aberration, an extreme and exceptional event that did not represent the normal conduct of American forces in Vietnam. The evidence accumulated by historians and by the military's own investigations suggests that this characterization was false in important ways. My Lai was exceptional in its scale and in the fact that it became public and was partially prosecuted. It was not exceptional in being an event in which American soldiers killed Vietnamese civilians, including women and children, in a situation where distinguishing combatants from non-combatants had become psychologically and practically impossible for the soldiers involved. The criminal investigation into My Lai, conducted by the Army's Inspector General and eventually by a special task force under General Peers, found credible evidence of additional incidents involving the killing of civilians in the same area of operations during the same period. The Peers report, which was completed in 1970, identified a systemic failure of command and institutional culture that went far beyond the specific actions of Lieutenant William Calley and his platoon. The report was classified. It was partially released to Congress in 1974 and more fully made available to researchers over subsequent years. The testimony given during the Winter Soldier investigation in Detroit in January and February of 1971, organized by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, included accounts from over 100 veterans of incidents involving the killing of civilians, the torture of prisoners, the destruction of villages, and other practices that violated the laws of war. The veterans who testified used their real names and provided verifiable details of their service. The Defense Department responded to the investigation by questioning the credibility of the witnesses and suggesting that some were not who they claimed to be, and the mainstream media largely ignored the event or treated it with skepticism. And the specific testimonies have been debated and analyzed by historians ever since, with a general conclusion: that while the event was organized by an anti-war group with a political agenda, the accounts given were substantially credible and documented a pattern of behavior that was more widespread than official sources acknowledged. The treatment of prisoners, both by American forces and by their South Vietnamese allies, is a chapter of the war that remained incompletely documented for decades and has only been partially illuminated by the release of military records and the work of investigative journalists. The formal rules governing the treatment of prisoners of war, derived from the Geneva Conventions and incorporated into American military law, were clear. Prisoners were to be treated humanely. Torture was prohibited. Coercive interrogation methods that caused physical or mental suffering were prohibited. These prohibitions were well known to American military personnel and were routinely violated, in varying degrees and in varying contexts, throughout the war. The CIA's Phoenix program, which operated from 1967 through the end of the American involvement, was a systematic effort to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure in South Vietnamese villages, meaning the political cadres, the tax collectors, the recruiters, the communication networks that sustained the insurgency at the local level. The Phoenix program operated through a combination of intelligence operations, capture operations, and what were officially called neutralizations. Neutralization could mean capture, defection, or death. The program's own records, which were partially released and partially reconstructed from congressional testimony and intelligence community documents, show that a substantial number of the neutralizations were killings, and that a significant proportion of those killings were extrajudicial, meaning that the people killed had not been tried, had not been convicted of anything, had simply been identified as members of the Viet Cong infrastructure and killed. The South Vietnamese interrogation centers that were attached to the Phoenix program and that operated with American support, funding, and in some cases direct American participation, used techniques that would today be classified without debate as torture, electric shock, water, suffocation, stress positions, beatings. American intelligence officers and military advisors who were present at or aware of these interrogations did not, for the most part, formally report or object to them. Some participated, some looked away, some filed reports that described what they had witnessed in language carefully calibrated to avoid the word torture, while making clear that coercive methods were being used. The institutional culture that enabled this was not a rogue culture confined to a specific program. It was an extension of the broader war culture in which Vietnamese lives, Vietnamese pain, Vietnamese humanity were assigned a lower value than operational effectiveness, or what passed for operational effectiveness. The Phoenix program is sometimes cited by its defenders as having been effective, and there is genuine historical debate about its operational impact on the Viet Cong infrastructure. But the terms of that debate are revealing in themselves. The question of whether a systematic program of extrajudicial killing and torture succeeded in degrading the enemy's organizational capacity is a military and strategic question. The question of whether such a program should have existed, whether it was legal, whether the people killed in its name were actually members of the Viet Cong, or were, in some cases, personal enemies of local South Vietnamese officials who used the program's kill quotas to settle scores. These questions were not part of the official debate about the program's effectiveness. The kill quotas are documented. Provincial officials were given numerical targets for the number of Viet Cong infrastructure members to be neutralized each month, and those quotas created exactly the same kind of distortive pressure that the body count created in the conventional military operations. The pressure was to produce numbers. Whether the numbers corresponded to actual Viet Cong infrastructure members was a secondary concern, and in some cases and some provinces, investigators concluded afterward that the quotas had been met in ways that had more to do with political convenience or personal vendetta than with genuine counterinsurgency effectiveness. The relationship between American forces and their South Vietnamese allies was a source of frustration, contempt, and corruption throughout the war, and the official communications about that relationship were consistently more optimistic than the private assessments. The South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, was created, trained, equipped, and sustained by the United States, and by certain measures it was a capable and at times an effective fighting force. Individual ARVN units fought with genuine competence and courage, but the South Vietnamese military as an institution suffered from problems that American training and American money could not solve, and that American advisors documented in private while their commanders minimized or denied those problems in official communications. The officer corps of the ARVN was political in a way that corroded military effectiveness. Promotion depended on connections and loyalty to the regime more than on military competence. Officers who avoided casualties, who minimized engagement with the enemy, who preserved their forces rather than employing them aggressively, survived and advanced. Officers who fought hard and took losses were vulnerable to being blamed for those losses by superiors who prioritized political considerations over military ones. The corruption within the South Vietnamese government and military extended from the allocation of supplies and equipment, where systematic theft was documented and tolerated, to the conduct of operations, where commanders sometimes reported engagements that had not taken place and casualties that had not been sustained in order to justify supply requisitions and maintain their unit's reported strength. American advisors who documented this corruption in their field reports sometimes found those reports edited or suppressed by their superiors, because the official policy required American officials to express confidence in their South Vietnamese partners, and expressing confidence in South Vietnamese partners was incompatible with reporting that those partners were systematically corrupt and incompetent. This tension between the operational reality and the official narrative was not a minor bureaucratic irritation. It was a fundamental distortion that affected every aspect of the American advisory effort and that contributed directly to the failure of Vietnamization as a policy. Vietnamization, the Nixon administration's program for transferring responsibility for the ground war to South Vietnamese forces while American troops withdrew, was presented publicly as a realistic strategy for achieving peace with honor. In private, many of the officials responsible for implementing Vietnamization had serious doubts about whether the South Vietnamese forces could sustain themselves against the North Vietnamese without the presence of American combat troops and the full weight of American firepower and logistics. Those doubts were expressed in classified assessments and in private communications and were not communicated to the American public. The withdrawal proceeded according to its political timetable, driven by domestic American politics and by Nixon's need to reduce American casualties to a level that was domestically sustainable. The military situation on the ground in South Vietnam was adjusted to fit the withdrawal schedule rather than the withdrawal schedule being adjusted to fit the military situation. The soldiers who remained in Vietnam during the Vietnamization period, those who were in country in 1970 and 1971 and 1972, were in some ways in the worst position of any American soldiers during the entire war. The withdrawal was underway. The policy had implicitly acknowledged that the war as originally conceived could not be won. The casualties that continued to be sustained were officially necessary, but privately understood to be serving primarily the political purpose of managing the appearance of the withdrawal. A soldier killed in a firefight in 1971 died not in the pursuit of a clearly defined military objective, but in the management of a political transition that had already determined the outcome of the conflict. This was known. It was not discussed in official communications. It contributed directly to the morale collapse, the drug epidemic, the combat refusals, and the fraggings that characterized the period. The journalists who covered the Vietnam War were operating in an environment that was unusual in American military history because the military did not impose formal censorship on press coverage. Reporters could travel to the field, embed with units, witness operations, and write about what they saw without their copy being reviewed and approved by military censors before transmission. This relative freedom produced some of the most important and honest journalism of the 20th century, and it also contributed to a conflict between the press and the military establishment that persisted long after the war ended, and that shaped military-press relations in subsequent conflicts. The military's complaint about press coverage of Vietnam, which became a staple of conservative critique of the war's outcome, was that negative and sensationalistic reporting had undermined public support for the war and contributed to the political defeat of a military effort that was otherwise progressing satisfactorily. This argument, which became known as the stab-in-the-back narrative in its more extreme forms, requires ignoring a substantial body of evidence that the press coverage was not the source of the problem, but was, when it was most accurate, a reflection of a problem that the official narrative had concealed. The reporters who wrote about the gap between official claims and battlefield reality were not creating that gap. They were documenting it. The specific experience of African American soldiers in Vietnam has been documented in oral histories and military records that reveal a dimension of the war that the official narrative consistently minimized. African Americans were drafted in disproportionate numbers during the early years of the conflict, before legal challenges and advocacy efforts produced reforms in the selective service system. They were assigned to combat roles at disproportionate rates, in part because the educational and occupational deferments that kept many middle-class white men out of combat were less available to Black Americans who had had less access to education and professional employment. In the field, Black soldiers frequently reported experiencing racial discrimination from white officers and from the institutional structures of the military itself. They were passed over for promotions. They were assigned to the most dangerous assignments. They were subjected to the same racism in the military that they had experienced in civilian life, compounded by the specific stresses of combat and the specific injustice of fighting for a country that was simultaneously engaged in a violent suppression of the civil rights movement at home. The racial tension within American military units in Vietnam intensified as the civil rights movement escalated and as the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy in 1968 sent shockwaves through the country that were felt immediately in the units in the field. African American soldiers who had followed the civil rights movement, who had family members involved in the struggle, who were watching American cities burn while they were fighting in Vietnamese jungles, experienced the cognitive dissonance of their situation with an acuity that was not available to those who had not lived their experience. The racial violence that broke out in rear areas and on some bases in 1968 and 1969 was documented in military records as a significant readiness problem, and the response to it was largely disciplinary rather than structural, because the structural issues, the inequality within the military, the racism within the officer corps, the broader social and political context of the civil rights era, were not things that could be addressed by military policy alone, and were not things that the military institution was prepared to acknowledge as its own responsibility. The question of what the South Vietnamese people, as opposed to the South Vietnamese government and military, actually thought about the American presence and the American war effort is one that official American sources addressed almost exclusively through filtered channels. The pacification assessments, the political reporting from American officials embedded in Vietnamese provinces, the reports from the South Vietnamese government itself, all of these were sources that were structurally biased toward producing optimistic assessments. The actual attitudes of the Vietnamese rural population, which constituted the vast majority of the South Vietnamese population, and which was the object of both the American pacification effort and the Viet Cong political organizing campaign, were more complex and more resistant to easy characterization than either the American official narrative or the anti-war narrative suggested. What can be said with confidence, based on the documentary and oral history record, is that the American military presence in South Vietnam was experienced by the rural population as deeply disruptive and often violently damaging to their lives, communities and livelihoods, regardless of the intentions behind it. The relocation programs that moved millions of rural Vietnamese out of their ancestral villages and into strategic hamlets and refugee camps were experienced as displacement and dispossession. The free fire zones and the bombing destroyed the agricultural landscape and the social fabric of communities that had existed for generations. The corruption of the South Vietnamese administrative structure that the Americans were sustaining meant that the services and security the pacification program was supposed to provide often failed to materialize or were provided selectively to those who had the right connections or could pay the right price. The Viet Cong's ability to organize and sustain itself among the rural population, despite the enormous violence directed against it, reflected in part the political failures of the American-supported regime in Saigon. Failures that American officials documented in private assessments and minimized in official communications. The chemical warfare dimension of the Vietnam War is a subject that remained inadequately documented for decades and that continues to be contested in ways that reflect the political stakes involved. The use of herbicide agents, particularly Agent Orange, which contained the highly toxic compound dioxin as a contaminant, was authorized and conducted as a deliberate military program called Operation Ranch Hand, which operated from 1962 through 1971 and sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicide over large portions of South Vietnam and, to a lesser extent, Laos and Cambodia. The stated purpose was to deny cover and food supplies to the enemy by destroying jungle vegetation and crops. The long-term effects on the Vietnamese population, including elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, and other health conditions in areas that were heavily sprayed, have been documented in epidemiological studies conducted since the war and remain a source of Vietnamese government claims against the United States that have not been fully addressed by compensation or remediation. The effects of Agent Orange on American veterans themselves became a major domestic political issue beginning in the late 1970s, as veterans who had been exposed to the herbicide in the field began to experience elevated rates of certain cancers and other health conditions and began to connect those conditions to their exposure. The Veterans Administration's initial response to these claims was to deny the connection, citing insufficient evidence. The scientific question of the health effects of dioxin exposure is genuinely complex and was debated among researchers for years. But the VA's institutional posture was shaped not only by the scientific uncertainty, but also by the financial implications of recognizing a class of service-connected conditions that would affect a very large number of veterans, and that institutional interest in minimizing the acknowledged scope of the problem was documented in internal communications that became public through litigation and through congressional investigations. The prisoners of war and those listed as missing in action constitute a chapter of the Vietnam War that has been used in American political culture in ways that often obscure more than they illuminate. The American prisoners held in North Vietnam, primarily aviators shot down over North Vietnam who were imprisoned at the Hanoi Hilton and other facilities, were subjected to systematic torture in violation of the Geneva Conventions. This is well documented. The torture was used to extract confessions and propaganda statements, and the treatment of the prisoners was brutal in ways that the North Vietnamese later partially acknowledged. The POW-MIA issue, which became a major political issue in the 1970s and 1980s, generated a substantial body of claims about Americans who might still be alive in Southeast Asia decades after the war. Claims that produced congressional investigations, dedicated government agencies, and a sustained political movement. The Senate Select Committee on POW-MIA Affairs, which conducted an extensive investigation between 1991 and 1993, concluded that there was no credible evidence that living American prisoners remained in Southeast Asia, while acknowledging that the accounting for missing Americans had been imperfect, and that the Vietnamese government had been less than fully cooperative with accounting efforts. The political energy that surrounded the POW-MIA issue, the memorializing of the concern, the commercial culture of bracelets and bumper stickers and flags was real and reflected genuine anguish. Its relationship to the documented reality of what had happened to the missing was more tenuous. The economic dimension of the Vietnam War, the way in which the war's costs were managed and reported to the American public, is an aspect of the conflict that has received less attention than the military and political dimensions, but that shaped the home front experience of the war in significant ways. The Johnson administration, in the early years of the major American commitment, chose not to ask Congress for a wartime tax increase to fund the escalation. Johnson's political judgment was that a tax increase would provoke a debate about the war's costs that he wanted to avoid, particularly because he was simultaneously pursuing his Great Society domestic programs and wanted to maintain public support for those programs. The result was that the war was funded through deficit spending and through monetary policies that contributed to the inflation that began to accelerate in the late 1960s and that continued into the 1970s. The economic costs of the war were real and were distributed across the American population through inflation and through the fiscal constraints that the war imposed on social spending, but they were distributed in ways that were less visible and less directly attributable to the war than a tax increase would have been, and so they were less politically legible as war costs. The soldiers who returned from Vietnam encountered a home front that was in various states of hostility, indifference, and confusion about what they had experienced and what they represented. The narrative of veterans being spat upon by anti-war protesters has been examined by sociologists and historians and has been found to be largely mythological in the specific sense that documented instances of such behavior are extremely rare despite the widespread belief in their occurrence. What is well documented is that returning veterans received very little formal acknowledgement of their service, that the VA system was unprepared and underfunded to deal with the scale of the mental and physical health needs they brought home with them, and that the condition that would eventually be called post-traumatic stress disorder was not officially recognized as a diagnosis until 1980, more than 5 years after the war ended, which meant that veterans who were experiencing its symptoms in the years immediately after the war were dealing with those symptoms in a medical and institutional environment that had no adequate framework for understanding or treating them. The institutional failure to recognize and address combat trauma among Vietnam veterans was not entirely a function of ignorance. Military psychiatrists and psychologists had documented the psychological effects of combat in Vietnam in real time, and some of their findings had reached the attention of officials in Washington. But the military institution had structural reasons to minimize acknowledgement of psychological casualties, because acknowledging the scale of the problem would raise questions about the wisdom and conduct of the war itself, and because the military culture of the period was deeply resistant to the legitimization of psychological vulnerability as a medical condition rather than a personal failing. Veterans who came back with severe anxiety, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and explosive rage were told by medical personnel, by family members, and by the culture generally to get over it, to move on, to adjust, and many of them tried and failed and ended up in circumstances of poverty, addiction, homelessness, and suicide that represented a second wave of casualties that the official accounting of the war's costs never fully incorporated. The specific trauma of the Vietnam War was shaped by features of the conflict that distinguished it from previous American wars in ways that military psychiatrists have analyzed extensively since. The absence of clear front lines, the inability to distinguish friend from enemy, the 12-month individual rotation system that moves soldiers through the combat zone as individuals rather than as units, and created a constant disruption of the small unit cohesion that is one of the primary psychological supports of combat soldiers. The knowledge in the later years of the war that the conflict was winding down and that the casualties being sustained were politically rather than militarily necessary. All of these factors combined to produce a form of combat stress that was particularly corrosive and particularly resistant to the social processing and collective meaning-making that helps veterans integrate traumatic experience. The rotation system deserves particular attention because it was a deliberate policy choice that had significant consequences that were not adequately anticipated. The Army decided to rotate individual soldiers through Vietnam on 12-month tours, with Marines on 13-month tours, rather than rotating units in and out of the theater as had been done in the Second World War. The official rationale for individual rather than unit rotation was to manage the Army's overall manpower requirements and to distribute the burden of combat service across a larger portion of the Army. The effect in practice was that experienced soldiers were constantly cycling out of units and being replaced by inexperienced newcomers, which meant that units were perpetually in a state of reconstituting their institutional knowledge and their combat effectiveness. It also meant that soldiers spent their tours as individuals, managing their own survival calculations in a context where forming close attachments to fellow soldiers was systematically undermined by the knowledge that those fellow soldiers would be rotating out within months. The psychological isolation this created was compounded by the abrupt transitions the rotation system imposed. A soldier could be in a firefight in the Central Highlands on a Tuesday and be back in the United States by Friday, with no decompression period, no transition support, no opportunity to process the experience before being reinserted into civilian life. The official documentation of how the war was discussed within the government, in classified cables and memoranda and meeting records that have been declassified over the decades since the war ended, reveals a sustained and remarkable pattern of internal skepticism coexisting with public optimism. The Pentagon Papers, the official history of American involvement in Vietnam, commissioned by McNamara himself in 1967, which Daniel Ellsberg leaked to the New York Times and Washington Post in 1971, demonstrated this pattern with devastating specificity. The papers showed that officials at the highest levels of multiple administrations had privately concluded that the war could not be won on terms acceptable to the United States, while publicly maintaining that progress was being made and that the commitment was sustainable and justified. The specific documents included in the papers showed officials acknowledging in private that the bombing of North Vietnam was not working, that the South Vietnamese government was too weak and corrupt to sustain itself, that the military metrics being used to measure progress were unreliable, and that the war was being continued primarily for reasons of credibility, the fear that abandoning South Vietnam would damage American standing with allies and adversaries around the world. The credibility argument, the idea that the United States had to continue fighting in Vietnam in order to demonstrate to the Soviets and the Chinese and to American allies that American commitments were reliable, was the most honest articulation of why the war continued after it had become clear that it could not be won in any meaningful sense. And it was honest in the sense that officials actually believed it. They believed that the international consequences of withdrawal would be worse than the costs of continued involvement. This belief was debated, contested, and eventually revised. But during the years when it drove policy, it produced a situation in which American soldiers continued to die, not for the freedom of South Vietnam, not to stop communism in the specific sense of defeating the North Vietnamese, but to manage the perception of American power in the global context of the Cold War. That purpose, even if one finds it strategically comprehensible, was not the purpose that was communicated to the soldiers who were serving or to the families who were being told what their relatives were dying for. The air war over North Vietnam, conducted through a series of campaigns with codenames like Rolling Thunder and Linebacker, was one of the most sustained and intensive bombing campaigns in the history of aerial warfare, and it failed to achieve its stated objectives. The objectives shifted over time as the failure became apparent, but the consistent core objective was to compel the North Vietnamese government to either stop supporting the insurgency in the South or to negotiate a settlement on terms acceptable to the United States. The North Vietnamese did not comply. They dispersed their military and industrial infrastructure. They mobilized the population for civil defense. They accepted enormous casualties and material destruction as the price of continuing the war. and they continued to infiltrate men and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail at a rate that the bombing campaign did not significantly reduce. American intelligence assessments of the bombing's effectiveness, produced by the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, consistently found that the campaign was not achieving its objectives, that North Vietnamese morale had not collapsed, that the leadership had not been compelled toward negotiation on American terms. These assessments were produced and circulated within the government and were consistently subordinated to the military's more optimistic evaluations when briefings were prepared for the President and the NSC. The pilots who flew the missions had their own view of the war, shaped by their specific experience of flying dangerous missions against increasingly sophisticated North Vietnamese air defenses, losing colleagues, being shot down, spending years as prisoners, and returning to a country that had complicated feelings about what they had done and why. The air war over North Vietnam was not an anonymous or impersonal exercise from the perspective of the men who flew it. Pilots were shot down at significant rates during certain periods of the campaign, and the North Vietnamese air defense system, which was built with Soviet assistance and included surface-to-air missiles and MiG fighters, was formidable and improving throughout the war. The losses were real and were grieved within the communities of aviators who shared the experience. But the strategic relationship between those losses and the war's outcome was a question that the institutional culture of the air services was not well equipped to process honestly, because questioning the effectiveness of the bombing meant questioning the strategy that was costing those losses. The Cambodian incursion of April and May 1970, when Nixon sent American and South Vietnamese forces into Cambodia to attack North Vietnamese base areas along the border, was presented to the American public as a decisive military operation that would cut off the enemy's supply lines and protect the flank of the withdrawal from South Vietnam. The military effects of the operation were real, but limited. The incursion destroyed significant quantities of supplies and disrupted North Vietnamese operations in the border areas for a period. But it did not locate or destroy the central command structure of the communist forces in South Vietnam, which had been the central military objective that Nixon had described in his April 30th announcement of the operation. The political consequences of the incursion, the explosion of protest on American college campuses, the shootings at Kent State, where National Guardsmen killed 4 students and wounded 9 others, the student strike that closed hundreds of universities, and the congressional repeal of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution were severe and lasting. The Nixon administration's response to the domestic opposition was to characterize the protesters as enemies of the country and to accelerate the internal surveillance and disruption programs that would eventually contribute to its own downfall. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which Congress passed in August 1964, and which provided the legal basis for the major American military commitment in Vietnam, was itself grounded in events that were misrepresented to Congress and to the public. The resolution was passed in response to 2 incidents in the Gulf of Tonkin in early August 1964, in which North Vietnamese naval vessels were alleged to have attacked American destroyers operating in international waters. The first incident, on August 2nd, was real. North Vietnamese torpedo boats did attack the USS Maddox, apparently in response to a covert South Vietnamese naval operation against North Vietnamese coastal targets that was being supported by the United States, a fact that was not disclosed to Congress. The second incident on August 4th was far more ambiguous. The intelligence intercepts and radar returns that were initially reported as evidence of a second attack were subsequently reanalyzed by American signals intelligence personnel, who concluded that the attack had probably not occurred and that what the radar operators had detected were most likely weather phenomena and nervous radar operators misinterpreting their own instruments. Lyndon Johnson was informed of this reanalysis. He proceeded with the request for congressional authorization for military action anyway. The resolution passed with 2 dissenting votes in the Senate and none in the House, because Congress had not been informed of the doubts about whether the second attack had actually occurred. The document that is perhaps most revealing of how the war's management worked internally is the study commissioned by McNamara, which became the Pentagon Papers. McNamara ordered it in 1967 after he had already begun to doubt privately that the war could be won, reportedly because he wanted a comprehensive historical record of how the United States had gotten to this point. The study was completed in 1969, by which time McNamara had left the Defense Department. It ran to 47 volumes and 7,000 pages, and it was classified top secret. It demonstrated, with the specificity of internal government documents, that every administration from Truman through Nixon had made commitments in Vietnam that exceeded what the intelligence and military analysis supported, that the Gulf of Tonkin events had been misrepresented, that the bombing campaigns had been assessed internally as ineffective while being presented publicly as decisive, that the diplomatic options that might have ended the war earlier had been consistently rejected in favor of military escalation. Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked on the study and who concluded that its contents needed to be made public in order to stop the ongoing war, photocopied it and delivered it to the New York Times. The Nixon administration obtained a court injunction temporarily preventing publication. The Supreme Court overturned the injunction in a decision that was as significant for First Amendment law as it was for the politics of the war. The village of Bentray became famous for a statement attributed to an American officer who described the destruction of the town during the Tet Offensive. It became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. The attribution and the precise wording have been contested over the years, but the sentiment was documented by Associated Press correspondent Peter Arnett and captured something real about the logical structure of the American approach to counterinsurgency in Vietnam. The logic that required destroying a village to save it from the enemy was the same logic that required designating large areas of the country as free fire zones, that required relocating millions of people from their homes, that required burning crops and defoliating forests, that required using firepower on a scale that could not distinguish between military targets and civilian ones. The logic was internally coherent if you accepted its premises, and its premises were accepted throughout the American chain of command for most of the war, and the conclusions that followed from those premises were implemented at enormous human cost to the Vietnamese population, both north and south, and the long-range reconnaissance patrols, the Special Operations Forces, the CIA paramilitaries, and the other elements of the American effort that operated outside the conventional military structure and outside the normal reporting channels, added another layer of opacity to the war's conduct and its documentation. MAC-VSOG, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, conducted classified operations in North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia throughout the war, including direct action missions, agent insertion, psychological operations, and intelligence collection. The group's operations were classified at a level that placed them outside the normal reporting structure, which meant that their activities, their casualties, and their effects were not incorporated into the official record of the war in any complete way during the war itself, and have been only partially reconstructed from declassified records and veteran testimony since. The men who served in SOG were conducting some of the most dangerous operations of the war, often in small teams deep in enemy territory, and they suffered casualties at rates that were not reflected in the official casualty reporting because the missions they were on were officially not happening. The South Vietnamese who served in the military and government of South Vietnam and who were left behind after the American withdrawal and the fall of Saigon in April 1975 experienced a fate that was a direct consequence of American policy decisions, and that was managed in official American discourse primarily by not discussing it in any specific or sustained way. The officers and officials who had served the Saigon government and who were not evacuated in April 1975 were subjected to what the new communist government called re-education, which in practice meant imprisonment in labor camps for periods ranging from months to years to decades, depending on one's rank, role, and the political climate at any given moment. The treatment of these prisoners was not gentle. Many did not survive. Many who survived did so with permanent physical and psychological damage. The Vietnamese American refugee population that left Vietnam in the years after the fall of Saigon. The boat people whose desperate voyages were documented in international news coverage included many people who had served the American-supported government and military, and whose departure from their country was a direct consequence of the American decision to withdraw support and to accept the terms of the 1973 Accords that made the fall of the South Vietnamese government a matter of when, rather than whether. The American officials who made the decisions that led to these outcomes were not, for the most part, held accountable in any meaningful way. McNamara resigned as Secretary of Defense in 1968 and went on to lead the World Bank. He published a memoir in 1995 in which he acknowledged that the war had been a terrible mistake and expressed regret for his role in it. The book was received with a combination of attention and fury, particularly from veterans who felt that his acknowledgement came too late to serve any purpose for the men who had died implementing the policies he had now declared mistaken. Westmoreland continued to insist until his death in 2005 that the war had been winnable and that it had been lost by political interference with the military's conduct of operations, a position that the documentary and historical record does not support. And that represented a sustained refusal to engage with the evidence of his own command's failures. Nixon and Kissinger, who made the decisions that prolonged the war through the Vietnamization period, are both in the historical record as having privately acknowledged that the 1973 Accords were not a durable peace settlement and that South Vietnam would likely fall without sustained American military support, which Congress then declined to provide after the Accords were signed. The landscape of South Vietnam, both physical and human, bore the marks of the war in ways that continued long after the last American soldier left. The unexploded ordnance, the millions of cluster munitions and artillery shells and bombs that did not detonate when dropped but remained in the soil and the water, continued to kill and maim Vietnamese people at the rate of thousands of casualties per year for decades after the war ended. American organizations and some government agencies contributed to ordnance clearance efforts in Vietnam beginning in the 1990s after diplomatic normalization. But the scale of the contamination was and remains enormous, and the resources devoted to clearing it have been inadequate to the scale of the problem. The dioxin contamination from Agent Orange persisted in the soil and in the food chain and was associated with elevated rates of cancer and birth defects in heavily sprayed areas that continued to be documented by Vietnamese and international researchers decades after the spraying ended. The memorial to the American dead of the Vietnam War, the black granite wall designed by Maya Lin and dedicated in Washington in 1982, bears the names of 58,318 Americans who died in the conflict. The wall was initially controversial, particularly among veterans organizations who felt that its design was insufficiently celebratory and did not honor the soldiers' sacrifice in the appropriate way. Over time, it became one of the most visited and emotionally powerful monuments in Washington, a place where veterans and family members left offerings and wept and found something that the official narrative of the war had not provided them. The names on the wall are specific and individual, which is part of what makes the wall effective as a memorial, and that specificity is a reminder that the body count and the strategic assessments and the official reports were abstractions built on top of individual human deaths that were real and specific and unrepeatable. The Vietnamese dead of the war, both North and South, both military and civilian, numbered in the millions. And there is no single wall or monument that captures that number in a way that makes it human-scaled and individual. And this asymmetry in the memorialization of the war's casualties reflects something about how the war has been incorporated into American culture and memory that has not been fully examined or resolved. The war ended, formally, with the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace and the last American helicopters lifted off from the embassy roof carrying the last evacuees. The images of that evacuation were broadcast around the world, and were understood immediately as images of American defeat, although the word defeat was not used in official American statements, which described the end of the American involvement in South Vietnam in language carefully calibrated to avoid the word defeat and the accountability that would come with it. The soldiers who had served in Vietnam were watching those images from the United States, having been brought home years earlier, and what they saw was the conclusion of something that had been consuming their country for more than a decade. A conclusion that did not resolve anything, that did not answer any of the questions the war had raised about American power and American purpose and American honesty, that simply stopped in the way that things stop when the energy sustaining them is exhausted, rather than when the purpose animating them is fulfilled. The official history of the war continued to be written and rewritten in the decades that followed, in declassified documents and scholarly analyses and memoir accounts. And what that ongoing process of documentation revealed, piece by piece, was the extent to which the official story told during the war had been constructed to serve the needs of the moment, rather than to record what was actually happening. The gap between the official story and the lived reality was not an accident or an oversight. It was a management decision made repeatedly and at every level of the institutions responsible for conducting and reporting the war, and it reflected something about those institutions, about their relationship to truth and to the people in whose name they were acting, that the war revealed, and that the official accounting of the war has consistently struggled to confront directly. The men who served kept coming home. The country that sent them kept looking for a way to make the story come out differently than it did. The war itself, in the meantime, had already ended, the way it was always going to end, not with a clear military conclusion, not with a negotiated peace that settled anything, but with the simple exhaustion of the American commitment, followed by the collapse of the structure that commitment had been sustaining, followed by silence.